It's an honor and also responsibility to be here talking about a crisis that unfortunately I don't share the view that it's over. It's only beginning. And I will try to make 2 points and to pose the 1 million euro question. The 2 points are that European citizenship has managed to make Europe perhaps more human, but only at the cost of becoming less social. And this has to do, and this will be the first point that I will be making, with the emergence of the concept of the economically inactive, which is the new bordering criterion. And the second point is that the elimination of physical borders has, within the European member states, of course, not the external borders, but the internal borders, the elimination of the internal borders, has resulted in the creation of new socio-economic boundaries. And I will try to illustrate that by reference to the status of seasonal workers and asylum seekers and refugees. The 1 million euro question is why a rich Europe, the Europe that we live in, is incapable of opening in the way in which Europe in 1945, which was literally destroyed, was able to deal with the influx of millions of refugees in some of the states. European citizenship is rightly said to have rendered European and national law more human by means of protecting the rights of free movement and of abode of the nationals of the member states of the European Union. However, the very same body of norms which have made life easier for individuals with economic and social bonds spanning across borders has strengthened the hand of the most affluent in European societies. The fact of the matter is that the substantive core of European citizenship is defined by reference to the 4 economic freedoms at the core of the single European market. Such freedoms are not only rhetorically claimed to be indivisible, and I stress rhetorically, but are regarded in the institutional practice of European institutions to be so. This creates the conditions under which European citizenship can be turned into the human face of the right of property owners, especially owners of financial capital, to contest the validity of regulatory and redistributive national policies and regulations by standing on the right to move, which includes the right to move their capital across borders, even to their countries, or threaten to do so. The famous OFE, right to strike of capital. A dynamics is thus unleashed which results in the undermining of the collective goods and the individual and collective rights at the basis of the social contract in the name of a borderless Europe. The price of rendering EU law and EU member states more human seems to be to make them less social. The proof of that is that the rights of European citizenship are no longer granted to Europeans, are granted to economically active Europeans and to economically active Europeans only. And this point is not a question of opinion, it's a question of the jurisprudence of the European Court of Justice. So I take my hat as a lawyer to show legally that this is the case. It could be argued that when everything else fails, Europeans can still make of the right to freedom of movement to seek new opportunities in other member states. Indeed, it is a fact that the Eurozone crisis, much as was the case with the shock policies in Eastern Europe before, of which Estonians know a bit, has resulted in increased migration, mostly of young persons. Is this not the ultimate proof that freedom of movement can indeed become a form of social policy alternative to the welfare state? Certainly not, and for 2 main reasons. The first is that characterizing the outflows of population, first in Eastern Europe, then in Southern Europe, as a paradigmatic example of how freedom of movement stabilizes polities in crisis, implies not only conceptualizing freedom of movement as a purely formal right, but also projecting this formalistic understanding of the constitutional order as a whole. There is no doubt that young Greeks searching for jobs in Germany find themselves in a far better position than Syrian refugees trying to reach Germany. It would be silly to deny that the status of European citizenship does not make things better in that sense. But from there to say that all these young Greeks are making use of their freedom when seeking jobs in Germany implies a logical and normative jump. Is this really freedom? Freedom exercised under economic duress, in many, if not most cases, is a formal freedom, not a substantive freedom. In actual material terms, there is no freedom being exercised at all. It may be that given the realm of possibilities, this was by far the best option. But if the best option is still one that has not only major personal and collective costs, and above all, is one that the person feels she is compelled to take, it is simply ought to keep on insisting on the emancipatory potential of freedom of movement. Especially given that the structural shift in terms of the overall European socio-economic model implies that the types of jobs on offer and the limited economic security they provide limit the actual chances of realizing individual private autonomy and public autonomy as a member of the polity. In brief, it is perfectly possible to say that given how things are, European citizens are better off having the right to seek employment in other member states because that's better than nothing, but it's not too much. We should, at any rate, avoid the normative ambitions in which freedom of movement tends to be wrapped. When socio-economic rights, including the right to freedom of movement, transform into formal rights, it is unavoidably the case that the degree of actual freedom resulting from their exercise is unevenly distributed. Only those with economic, material, and cultural resources will draw actual freedom from the exercise of these rights. The growing inequality within European societies is reflected in the unequal pattern of enjoyment of freedom of movement. It's very nice if you are a high flyer. It's not nice if you are looking for a job cleaning toilets in the British Museum. For the happy few, it has become an even bigger source of personal freedom. For the restless many, it has become the lesser evil, a passport to escape from unemployment, but which leads them not only into precarious jobs and into cultural and social alienation, at least for a far from short period of time. The second consideration, which I think is essential from a constitutional perspective, is that the inflows of young people coming from the eastern periphery first and the southern periphery now, I insist, have fostered a trend towards a break with the emancipatory understanding of freedom of movement and of European citizenship. In the case law of the European Court of Justice, but also in legislative proposals coming from the Commission, sorry to say, we can discern a form of citizenship conditionality, or what is the same, a limitation of the enjoyment of the right to freedom of movement to the person meeting certain criteria, in particularly being economically active. This entails that those who are not economically active lack protection from expulsion. Such conditional citizenship is clearly problematic. Citizenship in the democratic and social state indicates that basic rights are unconditional, a function of the status itself, both in terms of access to rights and very especially of the right to remain on the territory of the community. These and no others are the implications of the cases Dano and Alimanovic. That free movement is subject to condition is far from surprising. Indeed, it's unavoidable. The abolition of borders is only compatible with democracy if it comes hand in glove not only with formal equality, but also with institutional structures, decision-making processes, and substantive norms that guarantee a baseline equality within the new borderless area. If, as has been the case in European integration, it is pretended that formal borders can be abolished in the expectation that this would lead to more or less spontaneous socio-economic convergence, it's very likely that what would actually result is socio-economic divergence. Ms. Dano and Ilmanovic were trying to establish themselves in Germany, but they were regarded as a burden by the German government or the regional governments. The result is that they were declared not to have a right to stay in Germany. they have to go back. They are European citizens, but they are a burden. The problem here is that we used to have the category of worker, and if you were a worker, then you were allowed to stay. If you were not a worker, you were not allowed to stay. This was supposed to be transcended by European citizenship. But what we find now is that the old concept of a bordering criterion, a criterion to exclude, that was worker, now has mutated into the concept of economically active. There is a big difference between the two. And the difference is that while worker in the 50s and the 60s was protecting the weak, who were the workers, at the time of basically full employment, economically active is less legally concrete, therefore a weaker kind of a status, more open to be interpreted in ways that restrict your rights, and at the same time is intended to exclude. It's not intended to include the workers in the receiving community, it's intended to put them back in a train back home. So what we have is that the promise that we will get rid of limitations for Europeans to stay in other countries has been frustrated at the first contact with economic reality, so to say, that is the 2010 crisis. And I insist, Dano and Elimanovich are not opinions of scholars, they are rulings of the European Court of Justice on the basis of the requirements of the requests of the member states. So, European citizenship has clearly reached the wall of the reality of the pretensions or the claims made by the member states. One. The second has to do with to what extent we have made Europe more human, but we have made it less social. And we have made it less social by means of introducing criteria that are excluding. We have built up new economic boundaries by means of excluding certain categories of people. I think that in that regard, it's very interesting to contrast the evolution of the treatment in European law of different types of third country nationals. At the beginning, with the Tampere program, the idea was that there will be one single legal status for all third country nationals. So independently of what was your employment, independently of what was your age, independently of the country you were coming from, there will be in European law a package of rights and duties that will be the package of rights and duties of third country nationals. This was not accepted. What we see now is a fragmentation of the status of the third country national, with some third country nationals, like high-skilled workers, which are defined as those that are going to be earning more than 150% of the average income, and on the other hand, residual categories, so to say, in quotation marks, the seasonal workers. This is extremely interesting because in the same way that you have a facilitation, and you can go to the legal documents regulating these two figures, in the same way that you have a facilitation of access, a facilitation of bureaucratic procedures, a reference to the many rights that they enjoy from the moment they arrive, because they are highly skilled workers that are supposed to be contributing to the economy of the receiving states, you have the opposite kind of a status in the form of the seasonal workers. The guys who are picking up tomatoes in El Ejido, and we can eat all these unedible tomatoes all over Europe because Carrefour is distributing them all around. For these people, we have created this specific status. This is interesting, legally speaking, because we have created a category for something that does no longer exist, which is seasonal work, especially in agriculture. There is no longer seasons in agriculture. You can see that by going to the supermarket, and you can see that you can buy tomato today, and tomato was not supposed to be produced now. So it's interesting in itself, and this will be for sociology of law, why they introduced this category. You could start imagining, as I speak, why this was the case. But the key question is that they are denied the right to stay all through the year. At most, you can be in the European Union 9 months in the year. And in a very interesting recent obiter dicta, that is a side remark, so to say, of the European Court of Justice, so Advocate General Wall, they are not regarded as legally resident in the European Union. This is ruling of the conclusions of the Advocate General in case 477/17 regarding whether they are resident for the purposes of one specific regulation granting them rights. They are considered to be not legally residents. They are in limbo then, because they are legally working in Europe because they have a working permit, but they are not considered by the law as legally resident. This is interesting kind of paradox. But it's a paradox that is revealing of the precariousness of the status of seasonal worker, which, and we have the sociologists doing this kind of analysis, basically means that these people have to be staying illegally in Europe. We are creating, through the law, illegality, because it's not economically possible to be a seasonal worker in a non-seasonal agricultural sector, and at the same time, earning very low level of income and coming and going from your country of origin. So they are condemned to illegality. I can go, the directive is Directive 36, 2014. I could go through the different things, but for example, they can be provided with working permits for 5 years, but they have to live for some period. This is very strange. And they have a limited right of equal treatment with local workers, Article 23.2 of the directive. It's not a question of opinion, it's not a question of some political party asking the seasonal workers to be unequally treated. It's the law of the European Union that establishes that. The third, and I think I have to be careful now because we are reaching the refugees. The elimination of border controls within the territory of the European Union, Schengen land, entail the elimination of an institution that played a key role in creating the conditions under which autonomous asylum policies were possible, the border. We had Schengen, there is no more internal border controls. What was assumed is that it was possible to get rid of the borders and still keep national asylum policies. How? Through the law, integration through law. The idea was, and this is very interesting, I come back to this in a second, that each asylum seeker will be assigned to one and only one member state. The country normally through which you make entry is your European country. But that's interesting because in many ways it implies a tension with the characterization of European citizenship as post-national or cosmopolitan. Because at the very same time that Europe was pretending to transcend national citizenship, it was nationalizing asylum seekers because it was giving them the shirt of one country, if you allow me the metaphor. You entry through Italy, you are an Italian asylum seeker in this sense. You belong, you are in a special relationship to the Italian state. This special bond is one that the more that we have entered into crisis mode into the European Union has become important. Because if you enter through Italy, but then you go to Germany, Germany can return you to Italy because you belong in Italy. And moreover, even if you are, according to the proposals that are on the pipeline, I have been in the pipeline for quite a period, even if you have been recognized the status of refugee, you cannot establish yourself in another member state. You cannot exercise freedom of movement until the moment in which you have permanent residence. You have to work in the country which has granted you refugee status. So imagine, for example, that you are granted refugee status in Greece and there is no job at all. Bad luck. You have to keep on being in Greece because you are a Greek refugee. You know? These are the proposals that are on the table. This is the kind of renationalization. The question here is that this also eliminates rights that are granted under international law. Because under international law, you are entitled to apply in the countries that you wish for asylum. The fact that I have been in Italy and then I move to Austria, does not mean that I cannot apply, according to international law, in Italy and in Austria. European law takes away the right to apply for a second time in Austria, which means that it reinforces, leaving aside the opinion we can have about whether this is a good or bad idea, what I can say is that it reinforces the bond between the asylum seeker and the country of first entry. You are not a national, of course, but you are an asylum seeker of one country. You are not an asylum seeker of Europe. Now, what we have is not only that, but that there is a change which is the result, on the one hand, of externalizing the refugee crisis. Let's be frank, let's be brutally frank. The refugee crisis has not come to an end. It's only that the refugees do not land in Europe. This is the thing. How was this done? This was done by means of externalizing the crisis. And here we can start talking about the legal means of how this was done. This was done with exchange of views with Turkey that was intentionally not characterized as an agreement, because if it was called an agreement, it would require the approval of the European Parliament. And the European Court of Justice has sanctioned that this is not an agreement. So it's very strange, because legally speaking, we can have the discussion. If you are serious about the form of documents, I have lots of doubts about whether this is not an agreement. It looks like an agreement, it walks like an agreement, it barks like an agreement, but it's not an agreement. Then you have the mutual understanding. This is a new concept that is also coming from the financial crisis. You have the mutual understanding with Afghanistan, which includes also the maximum baggage that asylum seekers being returned to Afghanistan can take home, which I think is a totalitarian flash, if you allow to me. It's incredible that anybody in the drafting party was thinking about how much baggage they can take. I think this is revealing of a certain mentality, administrative mentality, so to say. And then we have the new normal, in a way that has been established, that the externalization takes place through bilateral agreements. So instead of the European Union, because the European Parliament will probably start complaining, instead of the European Union signing the agreement is signed by the member state. So it's Italy that has signed the agreement with Libya, okay? And then the question that emerges is which Libya, because there are many Libyas and this kind of stuff. Let's not go into that. We can go into the discussion. This is the first block. The second block is if they get here, what are the kind of rights that they are going to be having? And I was saying, on the one hand, is the generalization of the hotspot. You can look to the proposals that they are making. You will be into an administrative detention. This is the technical word that now is coming fashionable. It's not detention, it's administrative detention for the time of processing your application. Moreover, as I was saying, during the time at which your application is being considered, you will not be able to move. And even if you are accepted as a refugee, you will have limitations on the way that you move. All this implies that what we have is an original promise of emancipation through European citizenship and a practice that if you look to the three categories that I was referring to, if you look to the economically inactive, to the weak parts, the economically inactive, the seasonal worker, and the refugee, there is something very different from emancipation going on. Just a flash regarding how this stands in contrast with reality. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the United Nations Support Mission in Libya published in December 20th a report. And this report, page 31, reads as the following. What happens to the people that are trying to get to us and don't get to us because we have ended the crisis by making it impossible for them to reach us? The overwhelming majority of migrant and refugee women and older teenage girls interviewed by the United Nations Support Mission in Libya reported, overwhelming majority, reported either being raped by smugglers or traffickers in Libya, or witnessing others being taken out of collective accommodations and returning distraught, physically hurt, and or with torn clothes. The prevalence of rape among women who have transited through Libya has been corroborated by a plethora of sources, such as medics and other service providers, including in countries of origin and destination. They also take note that not one single person has been prosecuted. So what this basically means is that if you are a woman and you are trying to get Europe, thanks to the fact that we have ended the crisis, you are going to be raped, and to be raped repeatedly and viciously. And if you are a man, I don't read all the passages in the report, you are going to be tortured or treated in inhuman and cruel terms. This is the reality of the end of the refugee crisis. Now for the €1 million question. If Europe, that was, and it's the United Nations sources, it's not a newspaper. The €1 million question. If a Europe that was literally in ruins could provide shelter to millions, how is it possible that the far richer Europe of today finds extremely difficult to act and thus contributes to unimaginable conditions prevailing in the back doors of Europe? And I think, to conclude, that the answer has two parts. One is how we see the problem. And the way we see the problem is with blinders of two kinds. The first is that we disconnect the forced migrant from her background, collective and individual. Firstly, we distort the relationship between the forced migrant and the place of origin, which is relevant only in the case of some form of official prosecution. We have a concept of refugee that is interwar European period. You are a refugee if you are being politically prosecuted, not if your country is going economically belly up. But if we are democratic and social states, why economic duress is different from political prosecution? This is one question that we have to ask ourselves. The second way in which distort the position of the refugee is because we cloak in plain sight the aggregative effects of the exit move in the country of source. We are, or we pretend to be, very interested in the fate of the Syrians. But is there going to be a Syria to go back to? And that's the aggregative collective dimension. Even if, which we are not doing by far, even if we were solving the problem of the individual Syrians, what happens with Syria? So they cannot go back to their place, to their home. We have destroyed their home in such a way. And thirdly, the fact that there is a right to provide asylum does not mean that there are different ways of doing so in terms of redistributing the burdens. I think when Mario Draghi was saying the refugee crisis is an opportunity, his thinking is an opportunity in aggregative terms. But what about the distributive consequences of the refugee crisis? The reason why there is a considerable element of rejection towards forced migration is not unrelated to the fact that we have triggered war among the poor in many European societies. Now, we also tend, and this is the second way in which we distort it, to focus on the conditions at the receiving end. What happens to us? It ignores the very concrete responsibilities that we have in having built up the refugee crisis. So we can ask not only why were anybody bombing Libya in 2011, but, as has been recently asked, why is it the case that the currency that 14 French former colonies keeps on being anchored to the euro, which is exactly the same, is generating exactly the same kind of problems as dollarization is generating in many third countries. And this is done by the European Central Bank. This is not done by Donald Trump. This is done by the European Central Bank and by the French Treasury, so to say. On such a basis, I think the other answer to the question of the €1 million question, I finish, is that we have simply become less solidaristic societies. By this, I don't mean any kind of preaching of the Sunday that we have to be more solidaristic. It's simply a fact that the resources in order to deal with the problem are not there, and we are not willing that they are there, because the proclivity to be solidaristic in European societies is in the decline. And we have all very important and very relevant examples of people that have been enormously generous in dealing with the refugees, all this kind of stuff. But the key question, of course, is the capacity institutionally to take resources and redistribute them. And this is not unrelated to the European socio-economic model. And again, this is a question of how you distribute the consequences. It's not making the pie be bigger. This is not really the problem of European societies. The problem is how we distribute the pie. Okay, thanks a lot.